What if the person you disrespect the most holds the key to your future? A powerful CEO learns this lesson the hard way when his arrogant words towards a janitor come back to haunt him in the most unexpected way. You won't believe who steps in to defend the man he just humiliated. The city that morning glittered with glass and ambition. Sunlight slid across corporate logos and the gloss of taxes like a film that protected the people inside the towers from the true weather of the streets. At the base of one of those towers, among the quiet hum of havoc and the hollow echo of staff shoes on marble, an old janitor named Malik Carter moved through hallways that had learned to forget him. Malik cleaned the places where power liked to look spotless. He polished the rails where the board members paused, wiped fingerprints from the glass that magnified portraits of men in tailored suits. He performed his labor with a carved-out dignity, the kind that does not depend on applause but on the knowledge that certain rooms must be kept clear for the fragile breath of other people's schedules. Up above, in an office wrapped in oak and ego, Charles Whitman held the city in a fast, precise grip. Whitman's day was a ledger of meetings, a procession of decisions that reshaped other people's lives and hardly registered his hands. He had the right face for headlines and the habit of believing that the world bent proportionally to how loudly one demanded it. When his attention fell upon things it expected to be small, he found it easy to flatten them into the map of his convenience. On that morning the map contained a new line of irritation, a missed report from a key account, some small bureaucratic snag that translated in his mind into consequences minor for the pages of the company, catastrophic for the habit of being infallible. Malik, who had known the building when it had a different name and different men in its offices, was working the lower corridor that morning in the slow rhythm of someone who had made a place of his labor. His hands were steady, his back, though bowed with years, refused to be defeated. He had lived long enough to know that dignity was a posture more than a temperature, that keeping a broom straight in the hand could be a way of keeping a life upright. He had a son, Jalen, who sometimes came by with a bag of groceries and a laugh that folded warmth into the concrete. Malik kept a photograph in his locker of Jalen with his first college acceptance letter tucked behind his grin. The photograph was creased at the corners but intact like a promise. The encounter itself was swift and ritualized. Charles Whitman descended to review an incident report, and his eyes found Malik as easily as lightning finds a metal spire. Whitman's contempt arrived like a gust. It had been rehearsed on smaller things. To him, the janitor was an object to be rearranged in the shape of a solution. Malik's presence in the corridor that morning, a broom in hand, work overcoat properly buttoned, head slightly bowed under the shelter of habitude to Whitman as a value-laden footnote, convenient scapegoat, invisible labor necessary to be shaped and, if necessary, reshaped. Words exploded from Charles like a memo with teeth. He called attention to protocol, to image, to the petty arithmetic of the corporation that believed its worth must not be sullied by human error. He reduced Malik with the expert brutality of the practiced powerful, a few sentences sharp enough to cut, delivered in public for the taste of spectacle. He accused with the easy certainty of someone for whom apology was a resource one dispensed to keep consequence at bay. The effect was immediate. People in suits froze in place like wet paper. The cleaning cart, once a simple tool of labor, took on the heavy stillness of testimony. Malik did not answer in kind. He had spent years learning how to carry shame so it would not dent the lives depending on him. He kept his back straight anyway. For the men in the lobby and the assistants in their jackets, the moment passed on the winged back of an anecdote that would later be trimmed into gossip. The CEO unmoved, the janitor shamed, the machine of reputation intact. But the humiliation lodged deeper than gossip. It sat like a stone in Malik's chest. He let it lodge there and keep him steady, a quiet fuel rather than a consuming fire. People watched the scene and decided, in a dozen private calculations, whether to turn their faces to protect themselves from the next imputation. The stairwell returned to polishing, the air conditioning hummed on. Hours later, when the city lost its corporate temper and settled back into its business, a man moved through that same corridor with the gait of someone who had slept badly and been taught by life not to gloss over discomfort. Jalen Carter arrived with work boots scuffed by the commute and a face that had picked up the restless honesty of someone who had climbed 3 different ladders at once. He was Malik's son, tall, lean, a presence that households called hope when they did not want to say prayer. He carried no script in his pocket. He carried anger that had been distilled into purpose. Jalen had learned not to rush into spectacle, but neither to duck from it when it mattered. He found his father where he usually found him, bent to the work that kept other people's palaces clean. The sight of Malik, hands steady, broom like an old friend, taught Jalen how small stitches could hold a life. He saw, with the clarity that comes from familial love, what the public had chosen not to, that Malik was not the sum of a fleeting humiliation but the archive of an honest life. The confrontation that morning could have been a messy collision, but it took place in a way that refused theatrics. Jalen did not raise his voice into performance. He moved with the calm, precise leverage of someone who had been late too many times to let his temper make bad choices. He asked questions by the form of his posture and the steady directness of his eyes. He confronted the system, not with explosives of rage, but with the patient indignation of accountability. He invoked facts more than accusations. He called attention to the arrogance of assuming moral bankruptcy from the color of a man's uniform. Charles Whitman, in the presence of Jalen's quiet rectitude, felt a change. Power had trained him to respond to spectacle, to outshout and outmaneuver. Here stood a son whose rage was not performative but anchored in an expectation that the world could be made to honor the truth. Whitman's first instinct was to fortify his position, to reassert superiority. But there are moments when an authoritative posture, heavily relied upon, collides with the steadiness of a moral claim that is not market-priced. Whitman's composure wavered because he had not properly equipped himself to reckon with the consequence of his words. He had hoped humiliation would close the scene. Instead, it was making an opening. The lobby's watchers shuffled, unable to fake immunity. Some shifted their loyalty to the side that looked like reasonable decency. Others clung to the narrative they'd been taught, safety in aligning with the powerful. The architects of corporate courtesy, the assistants trained in damage control, waited with a protocol that might have saved reputations but could not repair people. Whitman found himself having to answer not with decree but with the harder courtesy of explanation. His words, for the first time that morning, required the small honesty of the man behind the office. The shift gathered force when a subtle truth emerged. The janitor, by way of years of observing, by way of small confidences gathered in night sweeps of floors and dusting of nobility, had been mistaken for what he was not. Something else hovered in the air, a recognition that the public's string of assumptions had done damage beyond the immediate insult. Malik allowed Jalen to lead and measured his response with the quiet of one who had lived under indignities and learned they were best answered by change rather than spectacle. He kept his dignity intact by refusing to let the moment be solely about his pain. He let it become, instead, a call for respect. It was in that unfolding that the building revealed a secret life. The corridors had ears, and those ears carried more than the sound of shoes. The security footage, the whispered reports, the timeline of the morning, these things could be marshaled when someone with the will to look insisted upon it. When the records were checked, a small scandal of assumption cracked. The bracelet that had been the thin pretext for Malik's humiliation was shown to have been misplaced in a wing where a guest's assistant had been seen scrambling. The evidence was not a dramatic exoneration so much as a slow, stubborn reveal. The world often misreads what it wants to be true. When the truth slid, with the meticulous bureaucracy of proof, into the open, it did not erase the sting of the previous humiliation. But it did something more transformative. It introduced the possibility that accountability need not always be a theater for the powerful. Jalen remained radial in his calm, insisting that the record be corrected and that an apology be articulated, not because he sought moral victory, but because he recognized the way reputations could otherwise be weaponized against the weak. He sought, in essence, to replace spectacle with repair. Whitman, faced with mounting proof and with the unexpected dignity of the father-son pair, could have doubled down on denial. Instead, compelled by the looming clarity of evidence and the public nature of the mistake, he chose a different route. He issued a formal apology, framed by the humbling mechanics of a man who had learned that his authority required proof more than it required posture. The apology landed with various weights. Some thought it was adequate, others thought it too little, but what mattered in the small house where Malik and Jalen kept their photographs and their daily bread was that a public wrong had been acknowledged. The city, hungry for a tidy moral lesson, worded itself into a tidy headline. But the real repair began in quieter rooms. The HR department rewrote a protocol. The guest assistant who had mislaid the bracelet was dismissed, and a modest restitution was arranged not to translate grief into bailment, but to fund a small scholarship for Jalen to pursue his further training and for Malik to receive proper compensation and public clearing. The reparative measures were not a currency of humiliation, but an infrastructure of dignity. The building, for its part, learned that its polish should not be the only thing that gleamed. What transformed the scene into something beyond news was not the monetary recompense or the signed letter. It was the slow reorientation of possibility. Jalen, who had come in anger, walked away with a measure of validation that was not triumph but permission. Malik kept sweeping corridors, but now the broom in his hand was also the reminder that the world could be corrected when someone insisted on evidence rather than assumption. He returned home each night with the quiet satisfaction of dignity restored, not because the world was now fair, but because one instance of unfairness had been faced down and altered. The arc of their lives shifted more than small patches could record. The apology had the indirect effect of opening doors for Malik and Jalen that had been closed by complacent prejudice. People who had once accepted the ease of judgment learned to pause. A receptionist who had watched the original scene felt a small, uncomfortable recalibration of what it meant to be a witness. The assistant who had misplaced the bracelet learned not only to accept the consequences, but to understand how small carelessness can amplify into social injury. And there was Whitman, who had been given the gift of being shown that power has edges. He was not a monster, he was a man whose reflexes had been honed on a diet of efficiency. Now, for once, efficiency had to mean something more than speed. It had to include the work of listening, the labor of humility. He instituted sensitivity training, he personally reviewed certain protocols, and he had, on one rainy afternoon, visited Malik's modest apartment with an envelope in his hand and a heavier thing in his voice than he had once used. The visit was awkward in its first minutes. A man who had built his life on command facing a household that had been commanded upon, but its meaning was clear. Power had been prompted to act in service rather than spectacle. The son and father, however, did not want performative regret. They wanted steady change. They arranged for a community day at which Whitman's company provided supplies to local schools and cleaned up a park that Malik had hard-mouthedly taken as a second office of care. Jalen, who had trained himself to be careful with rage and generous with action, began to speak at community centers about accountability and the importance of insisting on evidence over assumption. Malik, who kept his life measured and private, accepted the public clearing with a politeness that was not triumphal but restorative. He let the photograph of Jalen's acceptance letter be framed as a quiet emblem of what could result when dignity was defended. In the end, the lesson was not purely moral theater nor merely the satisfying arc of a viral story. It was a practical reconfiguration of how small actors and huge institutions might intersect. The CEO had been humbled. He had also used the occasion to make real change. The family had been restored a measure of peace. They had also used the moment to enlarge a horizon for others. And the city, hungry for its simple narratives, learned once more that redemption lived in details, in corrections to a report, in the formal clearing of a name, in the decision of a son not to let humiliation calcify into bitterness. That afternoon, when Malik pushed the cleaning cart out of the building and into the street, it was with a sense of a closed circle that had not exactly healed but had been rearranged into something less injurious. Jalen walked beside him, their steps matching the cadence of a city that had been taught something useful about humility. They did not seek acknowledgment beyond what they had earned. They understood, plainly, that dignity received in private and defended in public can ripple. The narrative the papers printed was tidy enough for readers who liked lessons and angry enough for commentators who liked two-point fingers. Yet in the small rooms where lives are actually lived, the story was more complicated and therefore better. A CEO had humiliated an old janitor, and the son had appeared and insisted on the truth. The result was not just an apology, but a set of behaviors that would keep the wound from reopening as easily. The janitor kept sweeping, the son kept watching with the fierce patience that love breeds. The CEO kept remembering he could be wrong. These were small acts of repair, not dramatic reversals, but they were the ones that mattered over morning and month. Under the city's neon and the corporate glow, Malik placed his broom in its corner that evening and looked at the photograph of his son. He had been humbled and then cleared. He had been abused by the public glare and then relit by the lamp of necessary justice. He and Jalen had won nothing in the currency of spectacle. Instead, they had won something steadier, the knowledge that dignity can be reclaimed and that sometimes the person you least expect holds the key not to your power but to your conscience. They walked home together, two figures moving through a town that had been reminded to look carefully, and in their quiet companionship the city learned a small, invaluable thing: how to be human to one another.